Well, today I'm going to look at the concept of technology and the centralisation of power and wealth. Interesting concepts, because what we've seen in the last decade is a increasing concentration of wealth in fewer hands, and increasing concentration of power in fewer hands. Even so-called representative democracies, in many regards, are little more than pseudo-dictatorships. So what has the digital revolution had to do with this concentration of power and wealth? As in Huxley's Brave New World and Orwell's 1984, what you had is this over-emphasis on supervision and being able, through a variety of mechanisms, having control over most things people did because of the surveillance. Now, what the digital revolution has done, it has allowed people who claim these virtual platforms are their personal private property to acquire extraordinary amount of data on anybody who uses these platforms, and is over almost 70% of the world's population, almost 6 billion people, use these platforms on a daily basis. The fact that the information which is fed into these platforms then becomes private property. At the other end of the scale, what we saw in 1984 in Brave New World, you have the state, which owns and utilises these platforms to acquire information on citizens to ensure they continue to centralise power and control what happens in that environment. So what has that got to do with the world at the end of, almost the end of the first quarter of the 21st century? The fact is that digital platforms and their ownership by state entities or private individuals or corporations has now set in motion a series of events around the world which allow a shrinking minority to not only dominate economic activity and acquire wealth, but it allows a shrinking minority to control political power. And one thing we learned from the US election in November was the fact that digital platforms have now become fundamental in terms of mass propaganda. Now, in the past, we had legislative mechanisms via which the power of individuals and corporations could be modified and controlled. And this, in a parliamentary democracy, to a significant degree, occurred through the parliamentary process, where legislation could be passed which allowed the state to protect its citizens from the worst excesses of the monopoly control of these emerging digital platforms. But the fact is that at the end of the first quarter of a century of the 21st century, the first quarter of the 21st century, we now find ourselves in a situation where these organisations are too big to fail. They're too big to be brought to heel by sovereign nation states. And if they are controlled by state entities, they're so powerful and so all-encompassing in terms of their knowledge of individual citizens that the ability to fight back in an effective way has been almost neutralised. Although occasionally we see the breakdown of the authoritarian model, as we've seen in Syria, but that has occurred after a devastating civil war that lasted over 13 years, which saw the destruction of cities and the death of almost 1 million people. So the fact is, the cost to control our destiny, because of the power of digital platforms and the fact that these digital platforms are owned by single-party states or state entities or private enterprise, means that every available statistical indicator and every available political indicator tells us that the private ownership of emerging technology and the ownership of emerging technology by state entities leads to the concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands. The fact is that every period in human history where power and wealth has been concentrated in a minuscule number of hands is when we see the greatest atrocities that occur in human history. The atrocities surrounding World War I, the atrocities surrounding World War II, the atrocities surrounding war everywhere. Because war and destruction has now become a digital enterprise. Somebody 10,000 kilometres away can set in train a series of events which will kill an individual with a little bit of collateral damage 10,000 kilometres away. And that's what we see in Gaza, and that's what we've seen in southern Lebanon, and that's what we saw in Iraq, and we continue to see in different disputes around the world. So the private ownership of fundamental methods of communication, fundamental methods of accessing knowledge, leads to the pauperisation of the population as a whole. Maybe not in terms of a physical pauperisation, but a mental pauperisation, and what I would describe as a financial pauperisation, where most people in most societies are indebted to some degree to corporate entities or the state for their survival. So there are costs to digital platforms. There are costs to technological innovations which centralise power. A classical example is the current rush to create renewable energy sources as the prime form of energy production. Now this could be done in two ways. It could be done in a decentralised manner, which would mean that you'd have decentralised energy sources owned by communities and cooperatives, which would provide energy to specific communities who would own and control the mechanisms by which that energy is created and distributed. But what we see today is the entry of the same people, the same energy corporations in the coal and oil field, who have now moved into the renewable energy sector and are talking about creating massive renewable energy production facilities which are owned by a centralised authority, whether it's owned by the state or whether it's owned by a private corporation. So you've got this dilemma. Do we centralise because theoretically it's more efficient, or do we decentralise and maintain our autonomy and power to make decisions and have the ability to share in the commonwealth and be involved in creating a commonwealth? But the dilemma is that everything is moving in the opposite direction. We see the centralisation of power in the hands of people who are little more, in the majority of cases, little more than representatives for that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And the greater the centralisation of power, and the greater the centralisation of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, the less possibilities to change things are available. And we see this. Australia is a classical example of this situation, because we live in a relatively rich country with extraordinary resources and a minuscule population compared to the rest of the world, but we seem to have the same problems decade after decade, century after century. Problems that are related to how wealth is created. Is it created through centralised forms of organisation, or is it created through decentralised forms of organisation? Not only how wealth is, but more importantly, we need to ask ourselves, why have we allowed this to happen? Whether it's the centralisation of the financial sector, energy, production, distribution, we have allowed this to happen because we have been told it is more efficient. Efficient for whom? Is it more efficient for the people who access those services or need those goods or need that security? Or is digital technology, which is centralised, the friend of the individual, or is it a curse? And ultimately, people are beginning to realise it's a curse. It's not that technology is the curse. The curse is not technology, but the curse is the fact that that power and wealth is easily centralised through the digital platforms. That is the curse we face. And we face that curse because the digital platforms are too big to fail. They are centralised entities. We can create decentralised entities. We don't need centralised entity in order to not just survive, but prosper. So in many regards, we are creating conditions which will lead to rebellion. Not just individual rebellion, but mass rebellion regarding the control that digital platforms are able to exert over what we produce, how we share what is produced, who exercises power. So ultimately, We need to look at decentralised forms of technological innovation. When the internet was first established, it was established for one good reason. It wasn't supposed to be owned. Platforms would be owned by a handful of individuals, which would then have extraordinary financial and political power. It was created to allow people to communicate in the event of a nuclear war. It was a decentralised form of technology. That's why so many people initially flocked to it, because it freed them from following the same narrative which appeared in the corporate-owned and the state-owned media. But it didn't take long for private individuals and corporations to manipulate the system to ensure that we were the product. That's right. Your information is the product. We were the product. And that digital platform, that product was then used, can be used to control us, not just financially, but socially, culturally, politically. So every day we are faced with this dilemma. And until we demand decentralised solutions, not just decentralisation in terms of city to regions and regions to rural, but decentralisation in energy production, decentralisation in terms of who owns these platforms. Are they community owned, or are they owned by a handful of individuals whose power crosses the borders of sovereign nation states, where we see sovereign nation states now incapable of controlling this monster? Ultimately, it's the people involved in running that monster which have the final say and the final power. For each corporate entity, there are thousands of workers who could, if they wanted to, take over those platforms and decentralise them. Do we follow the Chinese example and allow the state to collect extraordinary amounts of information regarding individuals and communities and use that information to maintain the power of the Chinese Communist Party indefinitely? Or do we allow the Musks of the world, the Bezoses of the world, do we allow them to continue to own these digital platforms which can have such a profound impact on so many people? Huxley's Brave New World and Orwell's 1984 were an indication of what would occur. And when you add artificial intelligence to this equation, where you need fewer and fewer people to run these platforms, you can understand that we will find ourselves in a particularly difficult situations unless we start from today calling, demanding the decentralisation of these institutions so that power goes back to the hands of the people and wealth is held in common and used for the common good, not for individual profit.